Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tearing into a highly clinical dossier analyzing the catastrophic seismic event that struck northern Venezuela on June 24, 2026. Now, we're not just doing a standard review of a natural disaster here. The data we're going to unpack treats this event as a definitive, real-world system stress test. Our goal is to completely separate the hard data from the social media noise and really trace the timeline of systemic stress and technological adaptation. So if you are an international emergency manager, a risk analyst, or an urban planner, listen up, because this information is absolutely vital for understanding exactly what happens when the very ground beneath a megacity fails. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our forensic timeline for today. We'll cover the physics of a doublet, the infrastructure breakdown, digital countermeasures, socioeconomic displacement, and finally, surviving geographic failure. Section 1. The physics of a doublet and regional trends. Looking at the timeline, the raw geophysics here are just staggering. At exactly 1804 local time, a massive 7.2 magnitude foreshock ruptured near Yumare at a depth of about 21.9 kilometers. This was driven by the immense grinding pressure between the Caribbean and South American plates, which move at roughly 20 millimeters a year. But here's the kicker. It was the terrifyingly short gap that followed that truly dictated the catastrophe. Just 39 seconds later, think about how fast 39 seconds goes. A second, more powerful 7.5 magnitude main shock struck at a much shallower depth of just 10 kilometers. That 39-second window is absolutely critical. It initiated microfracturing and load-bearing structural elements, it sheared joints, and it fundamentally pre-weakened building foundations across the entire region. And this brings us to a crucial clinical definition that we really need to understand: the seismic doublet. This happens when two earthquakes of similar magnitude strike close in both time and proximity. Because the structures in the affected zones, many of them made of unreinforced brick masonry and adobe, were so heavily compromised by that initial 7.2 foreshock, they were left completely unable to withstand the intense lateral shear waves of the 7.5 main shock less than a minute later. Honestly, it's a compounding kinetic nightmare for any structural engineer. When we contrast the unprecedented energy release of this doublet against historical seismic patterns, the sheer scale becomes stark. This was the most violent tectonic disruption to strike northern Venezuela since the 1900 San Narcisa earthquake. To put that into perspective, the infamous 1967 Caracas earthquake, which caused multiple high-rise collapses and widespread destruction, was a magnitude 6.6. The 2026 event completely eclipsed it in sheer kinetic power and systemic disruption. Section 2. Caracas infrastructure breakdown and local impact. Let's look at what happens inside the city. When a 7.5 magnitude shear wave hits a dense urban architecture, the breakdown is immediate. Methodically detailing this collapse, we see cascading failures across literally all major sectors. The Simón Bolívar International Airport suffered catastrophic structural damage, which completely shut down the country's primary aviation gateway, and, crucially, halted incoming international rescue teams. Natural gas grids had to be shut off instantly to prevent widespread fires. The Caracas metro and rail networks suspended. And most devastatingly, we saw progressive pancake collapses of multi-story buildings. This was specifically driven by soil structure resonance in deep alluvial zones, like what we saw in the Chiclayo and Altamira neighborhoods. But we absolutely must ground this clinical data in human reality. When buildings in affluent neighborhoods with brutalist architecture like Los Palos Grandes begin to shatter, the human toll is just profound. 18-year-old Sebastian Rodriguez noted, "I felt like the house was moving to a different rhythm to the earth. She was paralyzed by fear. That acute fear forced vulnerable, elderly populations to sleep out in the streets and public plazas, terrified of the dozens of aftershocks that were just continually rattling the fractured grid." And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer paralyzing effect of the disaster on essential services. Following the quakes, national telecommunications connectivity plunged to just 59% of normal levels. Power grids failed, and major telecom towers simply went offline. For emergency responders, this near-total cellular blackout severely restricted the flow of data coming out of the worst affected communities. It essentially crippled initial search and rescue coordination right when they needed it most. Section 3. The digital countermeasure and institutional capacity. Because, really, how do you coordinate a rescue when the grid is completely dead? What's really fascinating here is the rapid intervention from the private space sector. Starlink deployed a massive digital countermeasure.
They immediately waived consumer fees through July 25th, credited the accounts of active and canceled subscribers, and, most importantly, rushed terminal kits directly into the damaged zones of Yaracuy, Carabobo, and La Guaira. By utilizing their low Earth orbit satellite constellation, they actively bypassed the disabled domestic terrestrial grid. This provided local civil defense and international rescue teams with a resilient lifeline during that absolutely vital 72-hour rescue window. It was a real game changer.
Looking at the actual emergency directories published by Civil Defense, from the Bomberos de Caracas to the Seismological Center, we can really analyze the institutional capacity of local agencies. While these networks were definitely established, the sheer volume of structural collapses just overextended their capacity completely. When we view this through the lens of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, this heavy reliance on sudden external technological countermeasures, like satellite internet, highlights a critical vulnerability when it comes to localized emergency redundancy.
Section 4. Socioeconomic displacement and the poverty trap. Let's pull back and look at the long term.
Moving beyond that critical 72-hour rescue window and projecting into the long-term societal recovery timeline, we have to spotlight this massive metric. In the immediate aftermath, over 40,000 individuals were reported missing, and confirmed casualties are expected to rise significantly from the initial counts of over 200 dead and thousands injured. The sheer scale of forced migration and socioeconomic displacement here is staggering. When homes pancake and infrastructure is indefinitely frozen, people are displaced overnight. They are watching generational assets get wiped out in a matter of seconds. This triggers what economists clinically define as a poverty trap. These are vicious feedback mechanisms generated by sudden environmental shocks that make poverty completely self-reinforcing. Think about it. When a magnitude 7.5 main shock destroys a family's business, their unreinforced home, and the local hospital all at the exact same time, the asset loss is absolute. We've seen this directly in previous documented cases of environmentally induced forced migration. Just look at the aftermath of the 2010 Haiti earthquake or the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. Without massive external intervention, this displacement forces individuals into a persistent, localized poverty trap that can literally stall a nation's development for decades. So, the crucial point we need to take away is understanding the timeline of capital requirement. The Venezuelan government initiated appeals for $200 million in emergency funds to handle the immediate structural rescue, digging through concrete, bringing in international canine units, setting up medical tents. But that is entirely separate from the long-term socioeconomic recovery. Rebuilding the airport, redesigning urban zoning to withstand soil structure resonance, and lifting thousands out of a newly forged poverty trap. That requires multi-generational macroeconomic planning.
Finally, Section 5. Surviving unpredictable geographic failure.
Let's synthesize the systemic lessons we can extract from this devastating stress test. The core takeaways for risk analysts and urban planners are glaringly clear. First, seismic doublets effectively bypass standard building codes. A structure that survives a 7.2 quake might just be too internally fractured to survive a 7.5 quake hitting 39 seconds later. Second, terrestrial telecom redundancy is a myth in a catastrophic event of this scale. Alternative space-based data infrastructure is now a mandatory lifeline, for sure. And third, urban planning must fundamentally account for soil structure resonance, particularly in those deep alluvial zones where high-rises are the most vulnerable to lateral shear waves.
I want to leave you with this high-level question to really chew on. How can modern global architectures and urban planning frameworks realistically adapt to survive sudden, totally unpredictable geographic failure points? As our cities grow denser and our infrastructure gets more and more complex, technological adaptation isn't just an option anymore. It's literally our only path forward. Thank you for joining me for this explainer as we unpacked these critical insights together. See you next time.